Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever time you find yourself in on this planet. It's a great honor to be invited to give the keynote address for SHELLY JYOTI'S opening of her new exhibition, Epoch. Indeed, it feels especially wonderful to feel that this is a hemispheric meeting of the minds around the question of time and the times in which we live. JYOTI'S work brings into the present moment in the history of our species the centuries-old sense of time embedded in the image of the thread, the key transitional object between the fibers and the fabric, spinning and weaving, the fiber of being and the fabrication that makes up our world. Her virtuosity as a spinner weaver is evident in her bold compositions, weaving together images of mandalas as cosmic symbols of order and of catastrophic breaks, tears in the fabric and the fabrications. Her practice and productions are Gandhian in spirit, but thoroughly engaged with the present moment. This has led her to engage with some of my recent writing about this topic of temporality, my attempt to map out the present moment of our time, what we are calling the epoch and the epoch of 2020, which lingers on to this very day, October 29th, 2021. My approach to the question of time has tried to circumvent the question of being, the essence, the foundational notion that underlies the concept of time, and to move instead towards an iconology of time, the shapes, figures, and forms that time takes and that we shape time into. Instead of asking what is time, we should ask how we picture it and what our pictures reveal. Wittgenstein proposed this as the best strategy in general with abstract concepts like games, language, and number. Instead of racking our brains to find the common thread that defines the essential character of a concept, he suggested that we suspend that effort. He said, don't think, but look. What he found as he looked at these abstractions was something already embedded in his own language, namely the idea of a common thread that strings together all the examples evoked by a concept. It suddenly occurred to him that his picture of what a thread is in the first place needs to be modified. Turning to the concept of number, for instance, he points out that we extend our concept of number as in spinning a thread, we twist fiber on fiber. And the strength of the thread does not reside in the fact that some one fiber runs through its whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibers. This modest empirical observation about the way threads are made leads Wittgenstein to his notion of family resemblance as a better way to describe the worlds mapped out by abstract concepts. As he says, for the various resemblances between the members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, overlap and crisscross in the same way, and I shall say games form a family. What Wittgenstein does not say at this point is that the metaphor of family resemblance introduces a new dimension into the problem of abstraction, and that is precisely the question of time. A family, whether nuclear, cultural, family, or human, is a temporal entity that combines continuity with diversity and difference. The hidden essence of a family is not a single common thread, whether of external features or a single fiber of DNA, but a spinning of fibers to form a thread. I propose, therefore, to add to his list of abstract concepts, that is, numbers, game, language, the very idea of time itself. Instead of asking, what is time, we should ask, how can we and do we picture time in a way that includes the numerous phenomena memory, imagination, mechanical devices, seasonal cycles, actions, narratives, duration, and epochs that make up our use of the concept of time, without reducing them to some single common thread that defines its supposedly essential nature. This seems especially useful given our tendency to represent time with geometrical abstractions such as lines, circles, and points. The image of the timeline and of an irreversible unidirectional arrow of time dominates our notion of temporality, even as our experience requires us to modify the line and especially to thicken it in a way that complicates its abstract purity. One notable modification of the straight timeline in our time is the ever-present awareness of waves of death in time in the current pandemic. From the standpoint of planetary and lunar rotation around the sun, the lines of space-time inscribe circles, cycles, epicycles, and spirals that return to a same time that is also and always different. Sometimes time seems to stop or pause or suspend itself, or to undergo breaks that cut the line and introduce discontinuity. The idea, quite contradictory, that time is both endlessly divided and continuous at the same time is what underlies the common and companion concepts of the epoch and the epoche. The epoch is the period of history. The epoche, the punctuating moment of crisis or suspension that marks the divisions between periods. The epoche can also be, like this moment in time, an interval for pausing and reflecting, or even meditating quietly while spinning ideas and threads into a new fabrication. This picture seems especially vivid at a moment when time has seemed to intensify for great masses of people while pausing. And I'm talking about not just members of a family or society, but for what we used to call the family of man, the human species as a global entity. The epoch of the pandemic has produced a new planetary consciousness of time. The time before the year 2020 is often referred to as if it belonged to a different century altogether. And the time when the pandemic will subside or transform itself from a crisis into a new normal is an obsession of our future-oriented consciousness. The pandemic all by itself would be and has been sufficient to focus the attention of the world on time understood as the present, a dilated, expanded present, which has now lasted since the early days of the year 2020. But the pandemic has been accompanied by three other demics that rival the intensity of the plague we are enduring and that are especially evident in my own country, the United States. The first might be called the ecodemic of planetary climate change, which has suddenly become not a matter of speculative or scientific futures, but of present catastrophes in the weather, from violent storms to flooding to droughts and enormous wildfires. Alongside this, we have what I want to call an infodemic, a viral spreading of disinformation and outright lies that deny the existence of the other two demics and seek to reframe them as political issues that provide a possible route to absolute power and the destruction of democracy by authoritarian dictators. Finally, there is the upsurge of what can only be called the endemic tendency of the human species to deny the humanity of its fellow members and consign them to subhuman status in the name of race, caste, religion, or national identity. In the US, this tendency was made dramatically evident in the murder of a single individual, George Floyd, whose death was transformed into a global event that gathered up all the images of American racism in a single body. In short, we live, as the legendary and apocryphal Chinese curse would have it, in interesting times, a time in which the demos, the ancient foundation of that modern political invention known as democracy, the body of citizens, is looking like an endangered species. The geometry of linear time, with its figures of continuity, circularity, and the pointed punctual moment, has a logical resultant or a combined figure in the image of the spiral or vortex. This composite image took on a visible body in ancient Greek representations of time in the figures of Chronos, Ion, and Kairos, who personify, give body to the line, circle, and point. Chronos carries a scythe which cuts the line of life and time. In depictions from Rubens to Goya, he is associated with the murder of his own children as the horrific figure of Saturn. In contemporary depictions that emphasize his destructive, all-consuming character, Chronos can become a figure of the imminent epidemic that threatens the planet itself. Ion is associated with the cycle of the zodiac and sometimes with the Ouroboros, or the serpent with the tail in his mouth. In some renderings, he's associated with the eternal character of the Roman Empire as the ruler of the world through all the cycles of time. In times of revolutionary change, the vortex of time is reversed and overturns the sovereign, who seems to sink into a whirlpool or whirlwind, as in William Blake's renderings of the fate of tyrants during the French Revolution. Finally, Kairos corresponds to the point or punctum, the moment of decision, the opportunity which must be seized by the forelock in a timely way. Otherwise, he'll pass you by, and there will be nothing to grab hold of on his conspicuously bald head. As the personification of the moment, he also wields a razor blade that cuts the timeline at the moment of choice. If Chronos is the Grim Reaper, Kairos is Jack the Ripper. What keeps the spiral or vortex image of time in constant motion, circling around any present moment, like the forces in a whirlpool or vortex? I would suggest 4 vectors of time consciousness that range from our own individual lives, relatively short and small, to our membership in collectives such as nations and generations, to the time measured in our devices and machines, to the inexorable cycles of planetary time. All these vectors, or what a physicist would call moments of force, now impinge on our collective present as human beings caught up in consciousness of multiple forces beyond our control. Our epoch is clearly a time of Kairos, of fateful decisions, not for us individually, but for our species. Is it any wonder then that I am especially struck by a single work of SHELLY JYOTI'S among her many, many weavings and fabrications, namely the threads of Swaraj? This is a site-specific installation combining hand-spun threads, 50,000 of them, woven into a spiral form connected to a ball of yarn. And it seems like an uncanny summation of all the threads of my argument so far, from the notion of geometric timelines all the way back to Wittgenstein's picture of abstract concepts as threads spun out of numerous fibers. Indeed, JYOTI'S entire vocation as a spinner of threads and a weaver of abstract geometrical forms and fabrics seems to make material, literal, visible, and above all, tactile. Her craft is deeply rooted in a 5,000-year-old tradition of Indian fabric production that comprises a range of cosmic patterns with the meditative practice of spinning, as Gandhi famously encouraged, a half hour or a few hours per day in order to inculcate a sense of individual moral power, meditative calm, right alongside the political struggle for independence from the British Empire. As a nonviolent revolutionary figure whose example inspired a whole range of modern revolutions, Gandhi provided an alternative to the kind of violent uprising documented by Blake in the 1790s. At other levels, he was deeply traditional, anti-modernization, anti-capitalist, but also anti-socialist, and in favor of the caste system and traditional village life. Jyoti's work also reminds us of the deep genealogy of time images associated with spinning and weaving, from the spindles and distaffs of the three fates in Greek mythology to the shroud woven by day and unwoven by night in the legend of Penelope, the wife of Ulysses. As you'll recall, Penelope tells her impatient suitors who want to share her body and her crown that she will not marry anyone until the shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes, is finished. The threads of Swaraj seem especially close to this figure in its obvious display of its unfinished character. One can read the temporality of the weaving process in two directions. Read clockwise, it treats the ball of yarn as the source material that will complete the spiral. Read counterclockwise, it suggests that the threads are being unwoven, the vortex unwound, and the ball will grow in size as the spiral form is unwound. Is it too much to read this as an allegory of our planet and the destructive vortex of human activity that is shrinking the globe? Or is it an image of nurturing, the maelstrom of our species finding a way to nourish the planet as if we were connected to Mother Earth by a two-way umbilical cord? Shelly JYOTI'S current exhibition expresses a lively awareness of all the dimensions of the time we currently inhabit. The video that introduces her exhibition combines all these dimensions in a vertiginous montage of woven patterns, each exploded to be replaced by another. At the end of her animated presentation of the Epoch, she immerses us in the demic waves that seem to be washing over us in the current epoch. Whatever our reading of the threads of Swaraj, I want to make one final connection between it and a completely different treatment of the techniques and metaphorics of spinning, weaving, and mobilizing the uses of yarn. As you probably know, the word yarn in English vernacular means a story, usually a fabulous, improbable narrative. It shifts the emphasis on the figure of the timeline from a way to make abstract geometry and the threads that compose abstract concepts into a concrete and material thing, into the realm of storytelling, fabrication, and its material basis, the fabric. Like the song lines of Australian Aboriginal sand painting or the strokes of Chinese calligraphy, these are lines that thicken and pulsate as they delineate tales and arguments. In American culture, the yarn can also provide the syntax and sequences embedded in the fabric of mysteries, enigmatic stories, which promise but do not necessarily deliver a clear answer to the mysteries they present. I hope you'll forgive me for descending from the sublime spinning and weaving of JYOTI'S work to the rather mundane world of the American police procedural or cop drama, where the yarn serves, we hope, to disclose the secret pattern, the story hidden in the array of evidence that we have gathered. These two New Yorker cartoons illustrate this point perfectly. First, it all comes back to this ball of yarn, which seems to uncannily rhyme with the ball of yarn and the woven spiral of Shelley JYOTI'S threads, and its companion cartoon by a different artist, observing the same sort of evidence wall with all of the parts of it linked together by threads and by yarn, observing this is a troubling image because the detective, the observer trying to figure out the heart of the mystery, finds that he is entangled in the very thread. In the one cartoon, the thread goes back to the world itself, the ball of yarn. In the other, it goes back to the observer, the detective, the iconologist, the theorist, or the artist who is trying to weave the yarn into a plausible fabrication. Perhaps these are images of a peculiar American pragmatism about time, narrative, and the mysteries, enigmas, and paradoxes that beset our attempt to make sense of time, of what happened, is happening, and will happen. We have an inveterate desire to know who to blame, who caused the problem, and how to expose it. But our cartoonists here take on an ironic and what I would call a Gandhian perspective on the yarn they are trying to weave as something that leads us back to ourselves and to the world. Thank you very much.